38, unmarried, and completely pathetic. The words echoed through the grand ballroom of the historic Chicago hotel. 200 champagne glasses paused midair. The sharp cardboard edge of the red archive box dug deep into my palms under the silk tablecloth. The room smelled of heavy vanilla frosting, roasting meat, and expensive gardenias, thick and suffocating. My sister, Jocelyn, stood on the brightly lit stage in her custom silk gown, holding the microphone like a hunting trophy. She smiled her signature camera-ready smile, waiting for the laughter. It came. A soft ripple of chuckles from her friends, building into a wave of polite amusement across the room. At the head table, our mother, Marilyn, offered a soft, approving nod. My father, Graham, offered a slow clap, treating the public insult like an innocent family joke. I did not cry. I did not stand up and run out of the room. I let the cold condensation of my water glass numb my fingers, grounding myself in the physical sensation. I just looked toward the back of the room, finding Elliot at the soundboard. He stood in the shadows, his hand resting on the master controls. His eyes shifted toward Adrian. Adrian gave him a single deliberate nod. The romantic wedding montage on the giant LED screen behind Jocelyn stopped instantly. It froze right between a perfect photo of Jocelyn and her groom, Adrian. Then, the screen shifted. A jagged sound wave appeared in bright white against a stark black background. The digital timestamp ticked forward, illuminating the stage in a cold, clinical light. Jocelyn's own voice filled the room, stripped of its usual curated warmth. Rowan Vale is the only thing she has. Once she signs, even that belongs to us. Dead silence hit the room. The laughter died so fast it left an uncomfortable ringing in my ears. Adrian, standing beside his bride, turned slowly. He was the vice president of strategy for Mercer Media Group. He possessed a cautious, analytical mind, and he recognized the undeniable truth of a raw audio file when he heard it. He looked at me, sitting completely still at table 4. Then he looked at the woman he had married less than an hour earlier. Adrian looked down at the gold wedding band on his left hand. He did not yell. He did not make a scene. He pulled the ring off slowly and set it on the table in front of her. The quiet click of gold against wood felt louder than a gunshot. Jocelyn finally realized the screen was not playing a sanctioned video. She screamed for Elliot to cut the audio. Her voice cracked, desperate and shrill, echoing off the high ceilings. I watched her face contort in absolute panic. It was a stark contrast to how safe and powerful she had felt just 42 days ago. 6 weeks earlier, my sister did not even know that Rowan Vale lived under the exact same roof as the woman she loved to call a failure. 6 weeks earlier, in August of 2026, on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, I sat in my apartment staring at 2 different laptops. I was 38 years old, and my entire professional existence was neatly divided across those 2 glowing screens. On the left screen, I spent hours editing the latest episode of Jocelyn's inspirational podcast. I smoothed out her awkward pauses, added deep, reflective vocabulary she never actually used in real life, and stitched her scattered thoughts into a profound message. I was the ghostwriter, the freelance editor, the invisible engine behind her growing media empire. On the right screen, the real work waited. I opened the manuscript for my new psychological thriller. For 6 years, I had written under the name Rowan Vale. Rowan's voice was nothing like Jocelyn's. It was sharp, observant, and entirely mine. My phone buzzed against the wooden desk. It was Leah, my literary agent. Pre-orders for the new book are up another 15%, Leah said, her voice buzzing with genuine excitement. And Northline Press got another inquiry about the film rights. They really want you to do some on-camera press this time, Meredith. You have built this for 6 years. It is time to step into the light. No, I said, leaning back in my desk chair. Keep me strictly behind the scenes. Rowan stays anonymous. I needed that boundary. Rowan was my only private room in a life entirely consumed by my family's relentless demands. If Jocelyn or my mother knew I had a successful career of my own, they would find a way to make it theirs. As soon as I hung up with Leah, the phone rang again. My mother. Meredith, Marilyn said, skipping any form of greeting. I need you to rewrite Jocelyn's rehearsal dinner speech. And the seating cards got messed up. Plus, the publisher needs that new chapter for her self-help book by tomorrow morning. I rubbed my temples, feeling a familiar tension headache building behind my eyes. I will finish the chapter and the speech because those are in my editing contract, I told her. But I cannot do the seating cards or assemble the wedding favors for free. I have my own deadlines. Marilyn sighed. It was a heavy, practiced sound designed to make me feel small. Your sister only gets married once, Meredith. I thought you would want to be helpful for a change, since you do not have a family of your own to plan for. I swallowed the anger. It tasted like old ash. I will send the chapter tonight, I said, and ended the call before she could demand anything else. I stood up to stretch my legs and walked into my bedroom to grab a sweater. I stopped halfway across the rug. The bottom drawer of my desk was slightly open. Jocelyn had a spare key to my apartment for emergencies. She rarely used it, but she had dropped by earlier that morning while I was out getting coffee. I knelt down on the hardwood floor. A royalty statement from Northline Press, addressed directly to Rowan Vale, sat on top of a stack of old utility bills. I always kept it filed in a locked folder inside that exact drawer. Someone had moved it. My chest tightened, making it hard to pull in a full breath. I walked quickly back to my writing laptop and checked the security log. There was a failed login attempt from yesterday afternoon, right when I was at the grocery store. I flipped through the printed pages of my unpublished manuscript on the desk. Page 42 was gone. I did not call my mother to complain. I did not text Jocelyn to ask if she had been going through my apartment. That was what the old Meredith would have done, and it would only give them a chance to call me crazy. Instead, I took out my phone and photographed the drawer exactly as I found it. I sat at the computer and systematically changed every password on my accounts. I copied my entire manuscript history, all 6 years of it, onto a portable hard drive and slipped it into my pocket. My hands shook slightly as I clicked on the final security alert on my cloud server. The system had recorded the exact name of the device that had tried to access my hidden folders. The screen loaded, displaying a single line of text. The device was named Jocelyn's MacBook. The smell of burnt espresso and expensive vanilla perfume filled my apartment the next morning. Jocelyn stood in my kitchen, holding 2 artisan lattes and wearing a perfectly distressed denim jacket. She placed 1 cup on my kitchen island, offering a bright, practiced smile. It was the same expression she used on her podcast covers, designed to convey deep authenticity. I am completely stuck, Mer, my sister said, sliding a gold-embossed notebook across the granite counter. I need you to write my wedding vows. You know how I feel about Adrian better than I do. I stared at the leather notebook, and the sheer audacity of the request settled heavily in my chest. She did not want me to help her find her voice. She wanted to wear mine. I can edit them once you have a draft, I told her, keeping my tone perfectly even. I am not writing your vows from scratch. Jocelyn's smile tightened, the edges of her mouth going rigid. Do not be difficult right now. The family needs you to pitch in. I am pitching in, I replied, taking a sip of my own coffee. I just finished chapter 6 of your new book. She grabbed her latte and left 10 minutes later, annoyed that her usual charm had failed. The moment the door clicked shut, I opened my laptop and loaded the shared drive for her upcoming self-improvement guide. I clicked on the version history. My sister had left comments throughout the document overnight. The notes were not subtle. One read, "Rewrite this whole chapter." Another, placed next to a paragraph about overcoming adversity, simply said, "Make me sound smarter." I did not argue. I did not type an angry reply. Instead, I downloaded the complete document file with all the time-stamped comments attached. I saved the file, generated a security hash to prove it had not been altered, and forwarded a copy to Elena. Elena had not officially taken my case yet, but my intellectual property lawyer always appreciated a clean paper trail. That evening, the tension migrated to my parents' dining room for a family dinner. Adrian sat next to Jocelyn, nursing a glass of red wine while my mother held court at the head of the table. Jocelyn wrote her vows in a single night, Marilyn announced, beaming at her future son-in-law. Just pure, unedited inspiration. Adrian looked impressed, squeezing Jocelyn's hand. Graham, my father, carved the roast chicken with careful, deliberate motions. He refused to look in my direction. Meredith always preferred being behind the scenes, my father muttered, focusing entirely on his plate. I set my fork down, the silver clinking sharply against the porcelain. Do you remember my first manuscript, Dad? The one I wrote 12 years ago? A heavy silence dropped over the table. Back in 2014, when I was 26, Marilyn had undergone major spinal surgery. I spent months sitting in a hard plastic chair next to her hospital bed, writing late into the night just to keep my sanity intact. When the draft was finished, my mother offered to handle the business side of submitting it to publishers, claiming she wanted to help me succeed. I signed a limited editorial services agreement because I was exhausted and trusted the woman who raised me. It allowed Jocelyn to use the chapters she had specifically commissioned. It did not transfer my original manuscript, my journals, my pen names, or anything I wrote in the future. My father finally cleared his throat, still avoiding my eyes. Your mother always handled the business side of things. Let us focus on the wedding. I excused myself to the guest bedroom, closing the heavy oak door behind me. My phone vibrated almost immediately. Leah was calling. Northline Press wants Rowan Vale to do an anonymous audio interview, my literary agent said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. They are considering a full identity reveal right after the new book launches. Also, that film producer wants to read the early manuscript this weekend. I pressed my forehead against the cool window pane, watching the streetlights flicker in the Chicago dusk. Send all documents to the secure encrypted inbox only, I instructed her. Nothing goes to my personal email. Have you told your family yet? Leah asked. Not yet, I said. The line went quiet, and a strange sense of anticipation twisted in my stomach. Somebody already knew, and I was about to find out exactly what they planned to do with that information. When I returned to the living room, Jocelyn was standing by the fireplace, holding her gold notebook. She asked Adrian and me to listen to a practice read of her vows. She cleared her throat, performing the emotion perfectly. She spoke about trust, about building a foundation in the dark, and then she delivered the final line. I stopped breathing. The sentence was a perfect, word-for-word replication of a paragraph from page 42 of my unpublished Rowan Vale manuscript, the exact page that had vanished from my desk. I forced myself to relax my shoulders, keeping my expression entirely blank. Where did you get that last line? I asked. Jocelyn offered a modest shrug, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. It just came to me. Sometimes inspiration hits when you least expect it. Before I could press the issue, Marilyn walked into the room carrying a thick manila envelope. She pulled out a stack of stapled papers and placed them on the coffee table right in front of me. The bold black letters at the top read, Family Media Partnership. We need to get the paperwork sorted before the wedding, my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. This just puts all our projects under one management umbrella. It makes things easier for everyone. I picked up the document and scanned the first page. It was a complete surrender. The contract included a specific clause transferring the rights to all current and future pen names, explicitly granting Jocelyn and Marilyn control over any anonymous brands I might operate. I set the papers back on the glass table. I am not signing this. The fake sweetness vanished from Marilyn's face instantly. Her features hardened into something cold and calculating. You are making a massive mistake, Meredith. I did not stay to hear the rest of the threat. I grabbed my coat and walked out into the chilly night air, letting the heavy front door slam shut behind me. The train ride back to my apartment was long and quiet. I unlocked my door, dropped my keys on the counter, and opened my laptop to check the encrypted inbox Leah had set up. There was one unread message waiting for me. It was not from my agent. And it was not from the publisher. It came from an anonymous address, containing exactly 2 sentences. Check the signature on the first assignment agreement. It was never yours. The anonymous email glowed against the dark screen of my laptop. Check the signature on the first assignment agreement. It was never yours. Those words echoed in my mind the following morning as I sat in the downtown office of Elena Brooks. My intellectual property attorney adjusted her glasses, studying the printed copy of the 2015 contract. The thick paper rustled in the quiet room. I cannot declare this a forgery just by looking at the ink, the lawyer said, setting the document flat on her pristine mahogany desk. We need to verify the source files, the exact dates, and the chain of custody. My hands gripped the leather armrests of the guest chair. I signed the limited editorial services agreement, I said. I never signed this separate copyright assignment. Elena leaned forward, folding her hands together. Where were you on October 12th, 2015? That specific question sent me straight back to my apartment for a massive paper hunt. I spent 3 hours digging through old tax boxes and digital storage drives, searching for a ghost from 11 years ago. Finally, my fingers brushed against a faded plastic folder. Inside, a hotel receipt from Denver, Colorado, matched perfectly with 2 printed flight boarding passes and an editing conference registration. Chicago was 700 miles away from Denver. I was out of the state for 3 entirely documented days surrounding the exact moment my name supposedly appeared on that legal transfer. Furthermore, the digital trail told a similar story. An email sent to the publisher a week before the contract date contained a scanned file of the agreement with a completely blank signature line. A second version arrived 7 days later, fully signed, but I never received a copy of that final transmission. When I brought the Denver receipts back to the law firm, Elena nodded slowly. Do not attempt to log into any account that does not belong to you, she warned, pointing a pen at my notepad. We must keep your hands completely clean. We spent the next 2 hours turning her conference table into an evidence map. The attorney helped me divide my printed records into 4 distinct piles. One stack held authorship proof, another tracked unauthorized use, a third contained forgery indicators, and a final pile outlined their current retaliation plan. Looking at the massive spread of documents, a cold clarity washed over me. A single audio recording or a quick public scandal would never be enough to stop my sister. I needed an absolute trap, and my family was unknowingly handing me the pieces. That evening, a heavy knock sounded at my apartment door. My father stood in the hallway, looking older than his 66 years. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, carrying the faint smell of his usual pipe tobacco. Your mother is deeply upset that you refused to sign the partnership agreement, Graham said, examining a spot on my hardwood floor instead of looking at my face. You know how fragile her health was back then. That book money saved all of us, Meredith. I leaned against the kitchen counter, crossing my arms. Did you ever actually see the first assignment contract before it went to the publisher? My father shifted his weight, his shoulders sagging beneath his heavy tweed coat. Your mother handled the business side of things. Let us just keep the peace. Choosing the comfort of ignorance over reality, Graham turned and left my apartment without another word. The brief visit merely confirmed what the evidence map already suggested, and the pressure only escalated from there. My phone rang loudly just after 9 o'clock. Jocelyn was on the other end, her breath hitching in dramatic, calculated sobs. You are ruining my entire wedding week, my sister cried. Everyone is stressed because of you. Look, if you just sign the paper, I will give you a small royalty bonus and an editorial consultant credit on the next book. I stared at the glowing skyline outside my window. Put that exact offer in an email and send it to me. The line went dead immediately. Jocelyn was careless with words, but she was not stupid enough to create a paper trail of a bribe. Her refusal to write the offer down sent me back into my oldest email archives. I searched for messages from my mother during that chaotic month in 2015. Scrolling past hundreds of medical updates and scheduling notes, a single forwarded thread caught my attention. It was a message Marilyn had sent to Jocelyn, buried deep in a conversation about marketing. The second paragraph contained one isolated sentence. I handled Meredith's signature, so do not bring it up again. I remembered sitting in the hospital room, exhausted, while my mother patted my hand and told me not to worry about reading legal jargon when I was so tired. The next afternoon, Elena and I stared at her computer monitor. She had run a metadata extraction on the final signed document that my mother submitted to the publisher. The metadata is consistent with the file being finalized on a computer registered to Marilyn Hale, Elena said. It does not prove who created the signature by itself, but combined with her email, the earlier blank version, and your travel records, it matters. The walls of the trap were closing in, but a critical piece remained missing. Elena turned away from the screen, resting her chin on her hands. "We have the digital footprint," she said softly. "But to prove the theft of the intellectual property beyond a shadow of a doubt, we need the genesis of the story. Do you still have the original handwritten manuscript?" My heart skipped a beat. The original pages. The blue ink notebooks I had filled while sitting beside a hospital bed. I realized exactly where they were, sitting inside a red archive box, buried under a decade of dust in my parents' attic. "I need childhood pictures for the rehearsal dinner slideshow," I told my mother over the phone the next morning. Her voice instantly brightened, relieved that her useful, compliant daughter had finally returned to her proper place. By noon, I stood in the expansive foyer of my childhood home. Graham handed me the brass key to the attic, tapping his fingers against the wooden banister. He warned me to keep the storage boxes organized, completely unaware of what I actually came to retrieve. The wooden stairs groaned under my weight, and the attic immediately hit me with the scent of dry cedar wood, trapped heat, and decaying cardboard. I navigated through decades of discarded holiday decorations until I found a stack of plastic bins from 12 years ago. Just standing in the dusty room dragged me backward in time. I remembered the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. I had sat in a rigid plastic chair for weeks, filling spiral notebooks with stories to keep myself awake, while Jocelyn stopped by for 20 minutes, snapped a crying photo for her followers, and left for dinner. A battered red archive box sat beneath a pile of heavy winter coats in the far corner. My own handwriting covered the faded white label. The cardboard felt heavy in my hands, weighted with over a decade of stolen time. Inside the box, buried beneath a stack of loose family photographs, lay the original paper manuscript. The edges of the pages were curled and yellowing. I ran my fingers over the title page, stopping where someone had crossed out my name with a thick black marker. In the margins, Marilyn had left handwritten notes in her distinct looping cursive. The ink was faded, but the instructions were devastatingly clear. Change author later. Jocelyn will sell this better. Do not show Meredith until the deal is done. Beneath the manuscript lay my old leather-bound journal. I opened it to a page dated October 2014. My eyes scanned a deeply personal entry about a brutal breakup and the crushing isolation of caregiving. Those exact words, nearly verbatim, had appeared in Chapter 4 of Jocelyn's best-selling memoir. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit me. The woman who raised me had not just stolen my career, because she had also harvested my private grief and sold it to the highest bidder. The floorboards creaked near the staircase, pulling me out of the memory. "Those are just old brainstorming materials," Marilyn said. She stood at the top of the stairs, her arms crossed over a pristine cashmere sweater. "Families share stories, Meredith. You know that." I kept my breathing steady, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted. I held up the title page, letting the crossed-out name face her. "Why did you strike my name from the paper?" The matriarch of the family did not flinch, and her expression remained perfectly smooth. "You were always far too sensitive for the publishing world. You would have crumbled under the pressure, so I did what was best for everyone." I carefully closed the red box, tucking the manuscript and the journal safely inside. "I just need these for the photo scanning project," I said, my voice completely flat. I walked right past her, carrying the physical proof of her betrayal down the narrow stairs. Back in my apartment, I locked the deadbolt and set the red box on the kitchen counter. Before I could even take off my coat, my phone chimed with an urgent security alert. Someone was actively inside my cloud storage system. I opened my laptop, and my stomach dropped. A folder containing my latest Rowan Vale chapters had been dragged into the trash bin. The system had not permanently deleted it yet, so I quickly restored the files and locked the directory. Then, a new document appeared in the shared family workspace. The file was titled The Obsessive Sister Problem. I clicked on the icon, hoping to see the contents, but a bright red error message flashed across the screen. My access had been revoked immediately. The phone rang, shattering the quiet of the apartment. Leah's name appeared on the caller ID, and my agent spoke the moment I answered the call. Someone calling themselves the Hale family representative just contacted Northline Press, Leah said, her voice tight with panic. They are claiming that Rowan Vale is a shared family brand and the entire property is under a legal dispute. The panic in my agent's voice hung in the air long after the call ended. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I spent the dark hours compiling 6 years of tax returns, direct deposit logs, and private editorial emails. By 9 o'clock the next morning, Elena, Leah, and I sat on a secure conference call with the executive editor of Northline Press. Elena took the lead, her tone leaving zero room for debate. She systematically laid out the paper trail, proving that every royalty check and every signed contract belonged exclusively to me. The publisher remained cautious, preferring to avoid a public scandal, but they confirmed one crucial fact. No one except Meredith Hale possessed the legal authority to sign for Rowan Vale. We moved quickly to secure the perimeter. Elena fired off a formal preservation notice to Jocelyn's management team, legally demanding that all communications regarding my pen name go through legal counsel. I spent the afternoon registering my unpublished drafts with the Copyright Office and moving my savings into a new, heavily monitored bank account. These were not magical solutions, but they built a fortress around my work. 2 days later, the battlefield shifted to a sunlit dining room at the suburban country club. Jocelyn's bridal shower smelled of expensive champagne and melting buttercream. My sister sat in a high-backed wicker chair, surrounded by perfectly wrapped gifts and her closest friends. A videographer hovered nearby, capturing every forced smile and clinking glass. Jocelyn made sure to keep me in the center of her attention. She brought up my 38th birthday, my quiet apartment, and my tiny little editing jobs, all wrapped in a tone of exaggerated sympathy. Every single time she delivered a backhanded compliment, her eyes flicked toward the camera lens. She wanted a reaction. The realization settled over me like a heavy winter blanket. My sister was intentionally trying to push me into a public meltdown. I refused to give her the footage. I kept my posture relaxed, offered polite smiles, and answered her provocations with absolute silence. Adrian found me lingering in the hallway near the coat check an hour later. The groom looked uncomfortable in his tailored suit, holding a half-empty glass of sparkling water. He glanced around before stepping closer. "Those wedding vows Jocelyn read the other night," Adrian said, keeping his voice low. "They sounded exactly like a passage from that Rowan Vale novel you edited last year." I met his gaze, noting the genuine confusion in his eyes. He did not know the whole truth, but his sharp mind had started connecting the pieces. "Writers borrow more than words sometimes," I replied, keeping my tone carefully neutral. Adrian opened his mouth to ask another question, but Marilyn swept into the hallway and ushered him away for group photos. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. It was a text from Elena, containing a single screenshot. An anonymous source inside Jocelyn's public relations team had leaked a document. I stared at the glowing screen. The file was titled, "The Obsessive Sister Problem." The structured list outlined a precise narrative, painting me as a jealous, unstable woman obsessed with my younger sister's success. The final instruction made my blood run cold. It directed the camera crew to focus entirely on Meredith during the wedding toast, anticipating an emotional outburst. The planned humiliation at the reception was not an accident, and it was actually a carefully orchestrated trap. As I walked out into the country club parking lot, an unknown number flashed across my screen. I answered cautiously. "Meredith," a hesitant voice said. "This is Elliot, the sound engineer from your sister's podcast studio." I stopped walking, gripping my keys tightly. Elliot explained that he was currently editing a career tribute video for the reception, pulling audio from old studio sessions. During his review, he found a raw audio file from last month. Jocelyn and Marilyn had assumed the microphones were off. "Jocelyn ordered me to permanently delete the session logs," Elliot continued, his breathing uneven. "But studio protocol requires us to keep server backups until a project officially closes. You need to hear this." A cold wind whipped across the asphalt. "Play it," I told him. A burst of static crackled through the speaker, followed by the unmistakable sound of my mother's voice. "After the wedding, Meredith signs the partnership," Marilyn said, her tone sharp and ruthless. If she refuses, we release her journals to the press and let them tear her apart. The heavy, soundproof door of the podcast studio closed behind me, cutting off the street noise of downtown Chicago. The small room smelled of ozone, hot electronics, and stale coffee. Elliot stood by the main mixing board, his shoulders slumped. The sound engineer looked pale and exhausted, pointing toward a standalone computer tower that was entirely disconnected from the studio network. He handed me a pair of padded studio headphones, and I slid them over my ears. The leather felt cold against my skin. Elliot clicked his mouse, bringing up a raw audio file on the monitor. A digital timestamp confirmed the recording happened right after a podcast session last month. The continuous room tone and the glowing recording indicators showed that the microphone had remained active throughout the booked studio session. Jocelyn and Marilyn had both signed the studio's standard release authorizing continuous recording during the reserved time, although the release did not automatically authorize public distribution. My sister's voice drifted through the speakers, and she sounded incredibly sharp, completely stripped of her usual inspiring warmth. "Meredith is the engine no one sees," Jocelyn complained, her words clipping with irritation. "But she is getting restless," my mother answered next. Her tone was frighteningly calm, possessing the exact cadence of a woman managing a difficult real estate transaction. "Once she signs the partnership after the wedding, it will not matter. We will own every word she writes." The green waveform on the monitor spiked violently as my sister laughed. "I found her royalty statement in her desk," Jocelyn said. "I read the new manuscript. If she tries to fight us, we just announce that Rowan Vale was a collaborative family project all along. Or we release her sad little journals and tell everyone she plagiarized my podcast. We can use the wedding video to show how unstable she is." My stomach twisted, hard and painful. They were not just stealing a pen name, because my family was actively preparing to destroy my sanity in front of a camera. Then, Jocelyn brought up her future husband. "Mercer Media Group can package both brands once the ink is dry," she said. "Adrian does not need to know where the books actually came from until the contracts are locked. This marriage is the cleanest acquisition I will ever make." Elliot paused the track, pulling me out of the nightmare. He handed me a silver flash drive containing the original raw file, the server access logs, the studio session details, and the frantic email my sister had sent demanding he delete the record. An hour later, I sat in Elena Brooks's office. My attorney listened to the drive, and her expression remained entirely neutral. When the clip ended, she handed the silver drive to an independent audio forensics expert standing in the corner. She instructed the specialist to preserve the exact digital footprint without altering a single decibel. "This recording was made in Illinois," Elena explained, folding her hands on her desk. "Illinois generally requires the consent of all parties to record a private conversation. The studio release may support the recording itself, but its scope and any public use could still be challenged. I am not building your lawsuit on this audio." A wave of frustration hit me, but Elena held up a hand to stop me from arguing. "However," she continued, "this is incredible leverage. We do not need a judge to hear it right now. We just need to warn the right corporate partners. The audio acts as a catalyst for discovery, pushing the publisher to audit the paper trail." I wanted to send the file directly to Adrian, but the attorney refused. Distributing the audio carelessly could trigger a privacy lawsuit against me. Instead, Elena drafted a formal written notice. We sent a detailed transcript summary of the Mercer Media portion directly to the corporate counsel for Adrian's company. The letter offered their legal team a secure, private review of the original audio, provided they signed a strict confidentiality agreement. The transcript was not a substitute for our paper evidence, and Elena made that abundantly clear. It merely served to warn a major corporation that they were about to be pulled into a fraudulent transaction. I agreed to the strategy because I did not want to cancel the wedding or save Adrian out of some misplaced romance. I simply wanted to give another human being the right to be warned. Before leaving the office, I signed a legal acknowledgement. By taking this step, I was officially risking the exposure of my Rowan Vale identity. There was no turning back. The pressure multiplied as the weekend approached. A second message followed 3 minutes later. "Bring the red box. Mom says it contains family history we can use for the speech." My sister knew I had taken the box from the attic, They did not just want my signature on a new contract because they desperately needed the original handwritten manuscript back in their possession. 2 days passed in a tense, suffocating silence. Mercer Media Council confirmed receipt of our transcript notice. Yet Adrian never called me. The quiet stretched until Friday evening. My phone lit up on the kitchen counter with one final message from the bride. Tomorrow, you either sign as my sister, or I introduce Rowan Vale to the world as a thief. The morning of the wedding dawned with a clear, merciless blue sky. I arrived at the hotel ballroom, my hands gripping the handle of the red archive box until my knuckles turned white. Marilyn immediately descended upon me, her face a mask of frantic, motherly concern. She barked orders about missing boutonnieres and misplaced guest place cards. Clearly still operating under the assumption that I was the same fixer I had been for the last decade. I performed just enough to keep her from blowing up, handling a minor crisis for a group of elderly relatives, but I flatly refused to take over the wedding planner's actual job duties. Elena's evidence specialist had already scanned, numbered, and secured every original page. The red box I carried to the hotel held certified copies, not the only originals. It never left my side, a heavy, silent anchor in the middle of the chaotic luxury. Elliot, standing by the soundboard, caught my eye from across the room. He gave a single, imperceptible nod, confirming that he had locked the raw audio files behind a secure password, and that his sound equipment was fully compliant with the venue's requirements. By mid-afternoon, my mother, my father, and Jocelyn pulled me into the bridal suite. They dropped a heavy, leather-bound document onto the vanity. The words, Family Media Partnership, glared back at me in gold foil. "Just sign the papers," Jocelyn said, her voice dropping into a register of fake, wounded pity. "We can finally leave the past behind us. You will even receive a small percentage of the partnership profits if you play along." I opened the folder, flipping through the pages of dense, suffocating legal language. It was a complete surrender of my entire life's work. I looked at the 3 people who claimed to love me, and I felt a strange, quiet distance growing inside my chest. "No," I replied, my voice steady as stone. Marilyn's expression darkened, her fingers tightening on the back of the vanity chair. "You really have no idea how much trouble you are creating for yourself. If you do not sign, we will have no choice but to release those private journals of yours to every tabloid that will listen." I leaned against the doorframe, watching them carefully. "Those journals are currently logged in my attorney's vault," I said, maintaining perfect eye contact. "Any unauthorized release of that private material becomes a separate, verifiable criminal matter." Jocelyn laughed, a brittle sound that did not reach her eyes. "No one will believe a quiet, unmarried editor when they have a best-selling author standing right here." I did not mention that Northline Press had already confirmed my ownership of Rowan Vale. I simply turned away, leaving the room before the conversation could devolve further. My father followed me into the hallway, his face twisted in a mask of performative guilt. "I honestly never knew your manuscript had been taken," he muttered, grasping for a shred of decency he had long ago abandoned. "I just wanted to keep the peace." I pulled a crisp, printed email out of my pocket. It was a message I had sent him 11 years ago, begging him to look at the work I had written while caring for a sick mother. The response from his account was clear, demanding that I stay quiet because your mother is finally healing. "You were never interested in peace," I told him, feeling no rage, only a profound sense of exhaustion. "You were interested in the money. You decided that my silence was a fair price for your own comfort." He stood there, stunned by the cold clarity of my words, but before he could offer another lie, I walked away. The ceremony ended shortly before sunset, and the reception began less than an hour later. The air felt thick with expensive perfume and unspoken tension. Adrian finally found me near the bar, his eyes dark and exhausted. He told me that his company's counsel had arranged for him to review the raw audio in a private, secure session earlier that day. He had heard the truth for himself. I told him that the decision to handle Jocelyn was entirely his to make. I would not ask him to do anything, and I would not use him as a weapon. Adrian looked toward the head table, where my sister was currently laughing at her own reflection in a champagne flute. "If she denies her plan to use Mercer Media to steal your work during the toast," he said, his voice hard as iron, I will authorize Elliot to play the excerpt that mentions my company. I will not be used to facilitate a theft. The wedding toast began. Jocelyn stood up, tapping her glass with a silver spoon until the ballroom quieted. She looked at me, her eyes glittering with malice, and invited me to join her on the small stage. I set the red archive box on the table, felt the weight of the manuscript inside, and walked toward the light. Marilyn watched me with a hungry, expectant smile. Graham stood by the wall, hands tucked into his pockets, still trying to project his usual aura of neutral fatherly wisdom. Jocelyn lifted her glass, her gaze cutting through the crowd. "I want to thank my sister," she said, her voice dripping with sweet poison, "for teaching me exactly what I should never become." The ballroom echoed with polite, confused laughter. Jocelyn looked at me, clearly waiting for me to shatter. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence stretch until the air in the room felt too thin to breathe. I waited for the exact moment when the pride of the bride reached its peak, but I did not look toward the soundboard. The decision was Adrian's now. The screen behind us shifted, and Adrian took a deep breath, signaling for the audio to begin. Jocelyn leaned toward the microphone, her confidence still absolute, not yet realizing that her final performance had officially ended. I did not snatch the microphone from her hand. I waited until the laughter died down. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. I looked at my sister, who stood frozen in her spotlight, and asked her if she wanted to repeat those words when the music and the forced cheer were gone. She laughed again, a sharp, brittle sound, completely confident that I was one breath away from a total collapse. "You wanted witnesses," I told her, my voice clear enough to carry to the back of the ballroom. "Let them hear the rest of the story." Jocelyn turned toward the screen, her bravado still anchored by the belief that the audio files I possessed were legally toothless. She turned to the crowd, preparing to dismiss me as a bitter, jealous woman. Adrian stood up, his face devoid of any emotion, and he looked directly at Elliot. The engineer did not hesitate. He engaged the master fader. The ballroom, once filled with the clinking of china, descended into a vacuum of absolute stillness. The screen behind the stage displayed a stark white waveform against black. A short, damning excerpt began to play, capturing Jocelyn describing her marriage to Mercer Media Group as a strategic acquisition and laughing about how she had never intended to let her future husband know the books were not hers. Jocelyn lunged for the microphone to cut the feed, but Elliot had already locked the board. The bride stood trapped in her own broadcast. She looked at her groom, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, but Adrian did not move to comfort her. He looked down at the gold wedding band on his left hand, pulled it off, and set it on the stage like a judgment. "I am not choosing your sister," Adrian said, his voice quiet and steady. "I am choosing not to stay married to a liar." The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the guests. Jocelyn let out a ragged, high-pitched sound, but the attention of the room had already shifted. I reached into my red archive box and pulled out the folder containing my legal proof. I held up the original publisher contracts for every Rowan Vale book, tax records spanning 6 years, and the letter from Northline Press confirming that no one but me held the rights to that name. I held up the contracts and tax records long enough for the guests nearest the stage to see the matching name and dates. "Northline Press has already confirmed my identity through counsel," I said. "The originals are secured, and the rest will be handled through an audit, not through this ballroom." A few gasps rippled through the crowd, but there was no dramatic applause. Only the suffocating silence of people realizing they had been watching a fraud. Marilyn rushed forward, her face flushed with a desperate, frantic energy. She tried to snatch the papers from my hand, but I stepped back, holding them out for Adrian and the guests near the stage to see. Marilyn looked at the original manuscript, the blue ink still legible on the yellowing pages, and the sight of her own handwritten notes seemed to stop her heart for a second. "You were always so sensitive," she whispered, the words intended only for me, but her voice was captured by the still active microphones. "You would have crumbled under the pressure of the press, so I did what was best for everyone." Graham stood by the wall, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, his posture reflecting the crushing realization that his version of the family was currently burning to the ground. He looked at me, hoping for a shred of the empathy I had given him for years, but I could not find any to spare. Jocelyn, realizing her public narrative had officially disintegrated, reached into her mother's handbag and pulled out a stapled set of papers. She waved the assignment agreement in the air, her face twisted in a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You signed this," she screamed at me, her voice breaking. "You signed your rights away years ago. So this recording only proves that you are a jealous woman who regretted her own deal." The ballroom began to murmur, and I saw the doubt flickering in the eyes of the guests who had been closest to my sister. I waited for the peak of her desperation, for the exact moment she believed the forgery was her ultimate shield. I took out my phone, tapped the screen, and displayed the digital records for the flight I had taken on that day 11 years ago. I stood under the harsh light of the stage and looked at the crowd. "I was 700 miles away when my name appeared on that page," I said, my voice cutting through the panic of my sister's screeching. The shock on Marilyn's face was total, the sight of a woman who had spent a decade believing her lies were invisible. Jocelyn stood surrounded by 200 witnesses, holding a piece of paper that had suddenly become the most damning piece of evidence in her own collapse. The groom had already walked off the stage, leaving the bride standing alone with her mother, their desperate attempt to secure a media empire, ending in the quiet, absolute judgment of the people they had tried to manipulate. I kept my posture straight, holding the documents that proved who I was, and for the first time in my life, I did not care who was watching. The morning after the wedding felt strangely quiet, as if the world had collectively held its breath. I sat at my kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, watching the digital wreckage unfold across my laptop screen. Jocelyn had posted a video at dawn, her face puffy and stained with tears, claiming that I had destroyed her special day out of pure, deep-seated envy. My mother was busy making calls to distant relatives, spinning a frantic story about how the audio file played at the reception was a maliciously edited fabrication. I did not reply to a single message. I did not log onto social media to defend myself or offer a counter-narrative. Elena stood beside me in spirit, as her firm issued a single dry statement to the press. The legal notice confirmed that I was the contracting author behind Rowan Vale, that all original documents had been secured, and that Northline Press had opened a separate review into material published under Jocelyn's name. The statement was brief, cold, and entirely devoid of the emotional flair my sister favored. By the second week, the professional consequences began to materialize with the weight of an oncoming train. Northline Press officially froze Jocelyn's upcoming book release, citing an urgent need for an audit of all source materials and historical drafts. The major podcast sponsors that had fueled her media empire for years sent terse emails announcing an immediate suspension of their contracts. Adrian filed for dissolution of the marriage several days later. Taking off the ring had ended the performance, not the marriage on paper. Mercer Media Group, Adrian's family firm, issued a formal statement clarifying that they would not be participating in any business ventures involving Rowan Vale, distancing themselves from the entire sordid affair. These were not the sudden, dramatic bankruptcies of a thriller novel, but rather the slow, methodical grinding of institutional wheels. The civil discovery process started in the third month, forcing Jocelyn to turn over every cloud file, email, and digital draft she had ever touched. The document labeled The Obsessive Sister Problem finally surfaced in the digital stack, revealing every calculated move she had made. It contained the specific script she had intended to use, the camera angle she had chosen to capture my projected misery, and the talking points she had prepared to paint me as the unstable, obsessive sibling. It even included a draft of an acquisition agreement that would have undervalued my work while handing her complete control over my public image. I sat with my lawyer in a private mediation room, watching my mother and sister navigate the reality that they were losing. They arrived with the same performative indignation they had used for years. But the atmosphere in the room changed the moment Elena placed the original manuscript, with Marilyn's handwritten notes on the table. Graham sat in the corner, his head bowed. When Elena asked him directly about the email chain from 11 years ago, he finally admitted that he had known I expressed concerns about the contract, but he had chosen to look the other way because the revenue was too comfortable to ignore. Jocelyn stared at the paper trail, her face pale, as she realized her mother was already looking for a way to shift the primary blame onto her daughter to protect her own interests. The settlement was harsh, but it was grounded in the reality of what we could prove without relying on the recording that had sparked the chaos. My sister and mother agreed to recognize me as the sole author of the Rowan Vale series, stop all unauthorized exploitation of my journals, and return the royalty shares they had stolen over the last decade. They were also forced to pay a portion of my legal fees, undergo an audit of their other projects, and issue a public correction that we had all agreed upon in private. Marilyn had to sell the family's vacation property to cover the financial obligations, a tangible loss that signaled the end of their era of easy living. Jocelyn struggled to find her footing in the months that followed. She attempted to pivot to a new platform, posting videos about overcoming adversity and finding inner strength, but the comment sections were brutal. Every time she spoke about authenticity, a new wave of followers asked who was writing her words this time. She had lost her book deals, her speaking tour, and the credibility that was the bedrock of her brand. One evening, Marilyn called me, her voice shaking with a mix of fury and genuine disbelief. "You are destroying this family over money," she shouted into the receiver. I did not yell back. I simply looked at the stacks of unpaid invoices they had sent me for my own life, the bills for the time I had spent fixing their messes, and the decades of silence I had purchased with my own labor. "I stopped paying to keep your version of this family alive," I told her, and then I hung up the phone. I stopped processing their expenses, stopped managing their image, and stopped answering the calls that existed only to pull me back into the orbit of their needs. I was tired, but for the first time in my life, the silence in my apartment felt like freedom rather than a cage. Months later, the first public book signing for the latest Rowan Vale novel drew a long line that wrapped around the corner of the local bookstore. The readers who stood there were not looking for a spectacle. They wanted to hear about the woman who had finally reclaimed her own voice. I sat at the table, my hand aching from signing books, until a familiar figure appeared at the end of the line. Marilyn held a copy of my book, her expression carefully neutral, as if the settlement and the sale of the vacation home had never happened. She moved toward the table, ready to perform a reconciliation, but I looked past her to the next reader, leaving her standing there like a stranger in a crowd. The line of readers at the bookstore felt less like a celebration and more like a quiet reckoning. I signed another copy of the thriller, the pen feeling heavy in my grip. My name, Meredith Hale, sat in plain, bold print on the cover, right beneath the pseudonym Rowan Vale. My anonymity had officially vanished, sacrificed on the altar of the truth. Cameras from local news outlets hovered at the edge of the room, still eager for a crumb of the wedding scandal, but I refused to give them a performance. I kept my answers focused on the craft of writing and the importance of holding on to one's own narrative. Marilyn finally reached the front of the line. She clutched a copy of my book against her chest, her posture rigid. She leaned over the table, whispering that I really needed a professional manager because the business side of my success was growing too fast for a solitary writer to handle. I looked at the woman who had spent a decade treating me like a ghost. "I always knew you were special," she added, her eyes searching mine for a flicker of the daughter who would always say yes. "You knew I was useful," I replied, my voice cool and even. "That is not the same as knowing me." A store staff member stepped forward, asking if I wanted to invite my mother into the private area behind the sales desk. I shook my head, keeping my eyes fixed on the next person in line. Marilyn had to turn and walk out into the crowded store like any other customer, stripped of the influence and the backroom access she had wielded for so long. 2 days later, my father caught up with me outside a coffee shop near my apartment. He waited for me to stop walking, his face lined with a grief that looked genuine, though I knew it was fueled more by his own loneliness than by any empathy for my pain. He talked about keeping the peace, the same tired refrain he had used for years to justify his complicity. I looked at the man who had traded my voice for his own comfort. "Peace built on one person's silence is not peace," I told him. "It is just permission." I did not offer him a promise of forgiveness, because that was a transaction I was no longer willing to make. I told him clearly that if he wanted to have a relationship with me, it had to be on my terms. No more relaying messages from Marilyn, no more requests for money, and no more demands that I handle the fallout of their choices. He listened, his shoulders sagging, and for the first time, he did not try to argue. He just nodded and walked away, leaving me standing on the sidewalk in the bright, unfiltered sunlight. The final blow to my sister's delusion arrived via an email that pinged on my phone that evening. Jocelyn had attached a long, frantic document. She explained that her publisher was demanding a public apology, and she honestly did not know how to write one that would satisfy the public's demand for accountability. "You are the only person who knows how to make people understand me," she wrote, her desperation bleeding through the screen. I stared at the request, finding a dark, bitter humor in the fact that even now, she expected me to supply the words she lacked. I typed a short reply. "Then, it is time you learned how to speak for yourself." I did not edit her draft. I did not offer any suggestions, and I certainly did not open the attachment. I simply hit send and locked the phone. The film producer eventually circled back with a contract that respected the autonomy of the author, but the media attention continued to simmer in the background of my life. Leah insisted that the scandal was actually driving sales, but I chose to limit my public appearances to those that allowed me to discuss the themes of the book, not the details of my family's legal collapse. I accepted the fact that some readers would always know me for the wedding video, but I refused to let that singular moment define the entirety of my existence. Returning to my apartment, I walked into the bedroom and placed the red archive box on the top shelf of my bookshelf. It was no longer a hidden container of evidence, and it was no longer a cage of painful history. It was a history I had finally processed and successfully owned. I walked over to the desk, sat down, and opened a blank document on my computer screen. The phone vibrated against the wood, another call from the family home. I watched the caller ID flash until it finally stopped. I silenced the ringer permanently. The screen in front of me remained empty, waiting for the first sentence of a story that belonged solely to me. I took a deep breath, the weight of the past falling away like leaves in an autumn wind. My fingers hovered over the keys, and I began to type. For the very first time in my life, the name beneath the words would be my own. If you have ever found yourself quietly carrying the weight of someone else's expectations, you understand the suffocating price of keeping the peace at the expense of your own identity. You might have been the one who fixed every mistake, smoothed over every conflict, or sacrificed your own ambitions just to ensure that the people around you could maintain their comfortable illusions. You might have told yourself that your silence was an act of love or a necessary sacrifice for the sake of family harmony. But if you walk away with one truth from this story, let it be that peace built on the foundation of your own invisibility is not actually peace at all. It is merely an invitation for others to claim ownership over your life. There is a profound, often terrifying power in setting a boundary. When you finally decide that your voice is not a tool to be used by others, you will inevitably face the anger of those who have grown accustomed to your convenience. They will call you difficult, selfish, or ungrateful, not because you have done anything wrong, but because you have dared to stop playing the part they assigned you. Never let their discomfort convince you that you are losing your way, because the moment you stop paying the emotional bill for their version of reality, you are not losing a family, you are regaining yourself. You do not need to stage a grand public confrontation or wait for a catastrophic betrayal to start reclaiming your space. You can start by simply refusing to edit the parts of yourself that make other people uncomfortable. You can choose to stop providing the labor that others take for granted. And you can give yourself permission to be seen for who you actually are, rather than who you were manufactured to be. Reclaiming your name does not mean you have to be cruel. It just means you are finally becoming the primary author of your own existence, regardless of whether your family approves of the plot. It is a heavy, daunting journey to step out from behind the curtain, especially when you have been standing there for a lifetime. But think about the quiet, persistent voice you've been silencing for so long. Is it worth the cost to keep it buried, just so someone else can keep their comfort? Ask yourself this. What could you have built, and who would you have become by now, if you had spent the last 10 years writing your own story instead of perfecting someone else's?